In this film, we shall not only prove beyond all reasonable doubt that many of the official NASA images of lunar exploration are fake, but we shall also examine the motives for the biggest lie put before the world. Why did NASA repeatedly fake lunar images and photographs? Why did NASA stage lunar expeditions which did not happen? The answer will surprise you.
Clear the launching area.
NASA spent gigantic sums of money during the 1960s, but most of it was spent on the ground, not in space. Huge American corporations, many of which were manufacturing hardware for the military, made gigantic profits designing space vehicles and, more importantly, life-sized models of spaceships, and even huge stage sets resembling the lunar surface. Someone in NASA had realized that after taking billions of dollars from the American people, if they couldn't make it to the moon, they would fake it to the moon.
Former United States President William Jefferson Clinton. In his autobiography, My Life, published in 2004, he states on page 156, "Just a month before, Apollo 11 astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong had left their colleague Michael Collins aboard Spaceship Columbia and walked on the moon, beating by 5 months President Kennedy's goal of putting a man on the moon before the decade was out. The old carpenter asked me if I really believed it had happened. I said sure, I saw it on television. He disagreed. He said that he didn't believe it for a minute, that them television fellers could make things look real that weren't. Back then I thought he was a crank. During my 8 years in Washington, I saw some things on TV that made me wonder if he wasn't ahead of his time." To simplify, what Clinton says is that a gentleman expressed doubt in the Apollo claims, and he wonders whether that gentleman was correct. Now, exactly what is a former two-term United States president doing, wondering about the authenticity of the greatest technological achievement in the history of mankind? An event that had marked the legacy of his own boyhood hero, JFK.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Obviously, he has some reason to believe that the moon landings were not authentic. If a former US president is wondering about the authenticity of the claim, does it not make sense that you should wonder too? One can imagine why a former president would not want to come right out and blow the whistle by unequivocally stating his true beliefs. But he did, probably for the sake of his legacy, want to have it recorded that he did subtly flag the issue for those paying attention. Normally, the space shuttle orbits at an altitude of approximately 200 miles from the Earth, the same orbit altitude of the International Space Station. Now, you might be asking, why exactly is this maximum distance from Earth relevant to our discussion? Well, let's put it this way. The Moon is 240,000 miles away from the Earth. The diameter of the Earth is 8,000 miles. This puts the Moon at about 30 Earth diameters away. In relation to the space shuttle's orbit on this scale, it has never traveled more than 1/2 of 1 inch away from the Earth's surface. One reason the space shuttle has not been sent beyond 400 miles into space has to do with the Earth's magnetism. The core of the Earth is molten iron. As it slowly swirls around, it generates a powerful magnetic field surrounding the Earth. These fields cause the formation of 2 radiation belts around the Earth, called the Van Allen radiation belts. They are made of charged particles and are named after James Van Allen, who was in charge of the Geiger counters installed on the Explorer 1 satellite, which discovered the belts in 1958. These belts are formed by trapped charged particles. The magnetic field traps these particles that originate from the sun. They then spiral around the lines of the Earth's magnetic field, going back and forth between magnetic poles. Dr. James Van Allen published an article in the March 1959 issue of Scientific American that described the danger in traveling through these belts. In this article, entitled Radiation Belts Around the Earth, on page 47 of this issue, Van Allen states, "Our measurements show that the maximum radiation level as of 1958 is equivalent to between 10 and 100 Roentgens per hour, depending on the still undetermined proportion of protons to electrons. Since a human being exposed for 2 days to even 10 Roentgens would have only an even chance of survival, the radiation belts obviously present an obstacle to spaceflight. If anyone ever really does go through these belts, it will become apparent just how lethal they really are to humans." Other than the alleged Apollo trips, all other manned spacecraft have stayed below the belts. These belts do not officially begin until an altitude of 1,000 miles is reached. But when one space shuttle crew was brave enough to go nearly 400 miles above the Earth, they started to experience some unusual effects. They reported seeing shooting stars, which were a result of the radiation hitting the retinas of their eyes.
Thought of going back in over 45 years, and the fact that NASA has repeatedly admitted that we can't go past low Earth orbit.
This next generation spacecraft will enable America to explore beyond low Earth orbit.
We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
Right now, we only can fly in Earth orbit. That's the farthest that we can go.
The kinds of technologies that we're testing out on Space Station are definitely helping us with our goals of going beyond low Earth orbit.
Early in the next decade, a set of crewed flights will test and prove the systems required for exploration beyond low Earth orbit.
Earth orbit. Right now, we only can fly in Earth orbit. We only can fly in Earth orbit. That's the farthest that we can go. And this new system that we're building is going to allow us to go beyond and hopefully take humans into the solar system to explore. So the moon, Mars, asteroids, there's a lot of destinations that we could go to.
By the way, there's a small problem with going to the moon, and inch by inch, NASA is leaking out that they know that there's a problem there. It's called the Van Allen belts, high radiation belts of charged particles around Earth, and we don't know how to get through them, they say. Well, isn't that interesting, because there sure didn't seem to be a problem back in 1969. Obviously, they didn't go to the moon. The United States did not go to the moon. The Russians knew it all along. I thought at the time we did, but I've since learned we absolutely did not. And there's no question about it. How do we get through the Van Allen belts? They have all their top scientists working on it. It's a tremendous problem because we do not have any kind of a spacecraft that we can send up that doesn't have metal in it. And when these charged particles hit metal, they produce X-rays. Nothing you can do to get around that. So anybody sitting around something metal in outer space in the Van Allen belts is going to be French fried. And so that whole thing was a giant hoax. And you have second and third tier scientists in the United States who are running around saying, oh yes we did, yes we did. But the very top level people, what I call the tier one scientists, the Black Op Mill scientists, know for a fact we didn't go. And it's a real problem. They don't know how to get through there.
And if I'd have landed 20 feet behind where I landed, we'd have landed right smack in that crater.
When interviewed, Alan Bean of Apollo 12 initially stated that he had not gone through the belts and did not observe any effects caused by them.
Any ill effects from the Van Allen radiation belts?
No, now I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt. Maybe we did.
When it was pointed out that the flight pattern took him through the belts, he changed his story.
The belts are 1,000 miles to 25,000 miles above the Earth.
Then we went right out through them.
No effects on your cells?
We didn't even know it. I don't think anybody, well, maybe somebody said you went through the radiation belt, but we didn't feel it inside, and we didn't get any, added radiation.
Some scientists argue that the trip through the belts was so brief, that is only a few hours, that the radiation would not have had a negative effect on the astronauts. But the question remains, if these belts are not dangerous, why in the last 30 years has absolutely no country put even a monkey past these belts? The standard excuse is that no one has wanted to spend the money to do so. But to write off every advanced country in the world as too stingy and incompetent in over a third of a century to explore further than 400 miles from Earth really is a bit too much to fathom. It is more likely that we simply do not have the technology to go further at this time.
Six, 5, 3 main engines up and burning, 2, 1, and liftoff.
Just getting into orbit is no small feat, as is illustrated by the fact that in all of recorded history, only 3 countries, the United States, China, and Russia, have been able to put a human just into orbit and never being more than 400 miles from Earth. The explanation for this has always been that, except for these 3 countries, every other country in the world has been too cheap and lazy to venture into just Earth orbit. In reality, the reason has to do with the difficulty in accomplishing this. This most of all drives home the point that NASA's claim of sending men on a 240,000-mile trip in 1969, some 600 times further than they can send men today, is just not plausible.
600 times further than they can send men today is just not plausible.
Try to imagine the flight pattern of the Apollo moon missions. NASA says that 3 astronauts took off in a multi-stage rocket, and then 3 days later were in lunar orbit some 60 miles above the moon's surface, going about 4,000 miles per hour, or a little over Mach 6. Then, the spacecraft separated into 2 modules. One astronaut stayed in lunar orbit in the CSM. The other 2 flew down to the surface of the moon in the lunar module.
10 feet. Got contact. Engine stop. Okay, Houston, the Challenger has landed.
The lunar module is setting in the sun, which it always is. Then slowly but surely, that temperature inside is going to go up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, you ain't going to make it, because you're going to cook long before that.
What powered the air conditioning?
What powered the air batteries? You had a number of big batteries in the lunar module. They powered pumps, they powered the air conditioning, they powered the communication system, and that's the reason we were only able to stay on the moon 33 hours. Later on, we got a little better batteries, more batteries, and we could stay longer.
Now let's examine some problems with the astronauts' time on the moon's surface. In the sunlit areas, the temperature on the surface of the moon is 250 degrees Fahrenheit. If the sunlight struck the astronauts' suits or the surface of the moon, they would heat up very quickly. Considering that they always landed on the daylight side of the moon, the energy from the sun would be radiated directly at them, and additionally, the heat would be collected and radiated by the moon itself. Put simply, the astronauts had no energy source that would have enabled them to reject the sun's intense heat. The moon has no atmosphere, it has a vacuum. Conduction and convection could not practically be used for cooling. The heat would have had to have been radiated away.
I know, Bob. I know.
They carried no energy source potent enough to re-radiate this heat away.
What powered the air conditioning?
What powered the air batteries? You had a number of big batteries in the lunar module.
Alan Bean's explanation of using batteries is not convincing. Efforts to explain successful functioning of the spacesuits amount to elaborate double talk.
Fantastic, sports fans.
After allegedly spending 3 days on the surface, the 2 astronauts blasted off, went up 69 miles, somehow docked with the command module traveling at a speed of over 4,000 miles per hour, and then they all flew back to Earth for a round trip of 480,000 miles. Doesn't this seem a bit beyond 1969 technology? How can this be explained as anything other than an accomplishment beyond belief?
This whole issue of getting at truth and reality, and specifically in the area of the Apollo moon missions, what happened and what didn't happen. And when the module set down on the surface of the moon, the amount of propulsion that would have been required to do that, and it leaves no cloud of dust, no crater.
having seen hundreds of rocket firings when I was employed by Rocketdyne, I know that the jet of the lunar module lander, the lunar lander, would have created an enormous crater. It would have scoured the moon's surface. It would have tossed up rocks, sand, everything, and created a crater maybe so large that the entire lunar lander could have sunk into it. After all, we're dealing with a 10,000-pound thrust engine, which is pointed directly at the surface, lowered into the surface, and yet, if you look at pictures of the lunar lander on the moon, there is no disturbance whatsoever under the lunar lander's rocket.
And no dust deposited in the pads, the cup-shaped pads at the bottom.
That's another good point. Dust would have been blown 6 ways from Sunday and would have landed everywhere.
The photographs also fail under critical analysis.
Why are such important images so grainy and hard to see?
And we're getting a picture on the TV. You got a good picture, huh?
NASA claims it's the result of 1960s technology.
NASA orchestrated the hoax in a very unique way, through television. They had one picture which they completely controlled, black and white, grainy, that convinced everybody we were on the moon. We had no reason to doubt it. They had complete reins over the pictures, over the sound. I mean, sad to say, it was easier than people believe.
Evidence suggesting that these images were staged.
It's absolutely unreal.
Although it appears that the astronauts are moving in the moon's gravity, which is 1/6 that of the Earth, Percy notes that when the speed of the film is doubled, the astronauts appear to be running as if in Earth's gravity. Also, when the footage of the lunar rover is doubled in speed, it looks as if it's driving here on Earth. If there is no air or wind on the moon, why is this American flag waving?
The fact that the flag flaps on the moon where there's no atmosphere means that there must have been a little blast of wind out in Area 51 where they shot this. The pictures that we see that allegedly were taken on the moon are absolutely perfect.
But with closer examination, Casing says flaws begin to emerge.
Unfortunately, errors were made which are now being discovered.
Point out that lighting is a major flaw in the lunar photos. Case in point, on the moon, the astronauts' only source of light was the sun.
They had no extra lighting, no flashes, no things like that.
Yet in this photograph from Apollo 14, the shadows are cast in different directions, suggesting multiple light sources.
The shadows cast by the rocks in the foreground should have been east-west, like the LEM shadows.
And in this photo from Apollo 17, again the shadows are pointing in different directions.
Outside in sunlight, shadows always run parallel with one another, so the shadows will never intersect.
Conspiracy theorists say it's not just the shadows that indicate the use of additional lights, but what has been photographed in the shadows. For example, here's an astronaut who descends into a huge shadow cast by the lunar module. Yet his entire body is still visible. How is it that he is not shrouded in darkness? Here's the same maneuver from another Apollo mission. Again, the astronaut is brightly lit in what is obviously dark shadow. And in this picture, the sun is directly behind the astronaut. His figure should be a silhouette. Yet even the smallest characteristics of his suit are recognizable.
It seems like he's standing in the spotlight. And I can't explain that. That escapes me. Why?
And finally, in this picture with the sun behind the lunar module, the front of the craft is clearly visible. The words United States are crisp and clear. How could these backlit pictures be so detailed?
It's because there's more than one light source, which means they're not on the moon.
But NASA simply dismisses these arguments. But the questions continue. Why do some of these images shot at different times and different places appear to have identical backgrounds? These two photos seem to have the same mountain backdrop, yet the lunar module is only present in one of them. Seemingly impossible, since the LEM never moved and its base remained even after the mission. Some suggest the same artificial backdrop was used when shooting two entirely separate pictures. Background discrepancies are also apparent in the lunar video.
The best evidence are some pictorial anomalies in the photographic record of the trip to the moon. There is one for Apollo 16 where the same shot, the same hill, appears in 2 different days.
This tape was shot on what was reported to be the first of Apollo 16's lunar excursions.
But it couldn't pick a better spot.
And this video was from the next day at a different location.
It is the most beautiful sight.
NASA claims the second location was 2.5 miles away. But when one video is superimposed over the other, the locations appear identical. Even closer examination of the photos suggests evidence of doctoring. For reference, crosshairs were permanently etched into the lunar cameras, so they would have to appear on top of every image. But in this photo, a crosshair is behind a part of the lunar rover.
This situation is impossible and has to be the result of technical manipulation and doctoring of the image.
And in this photo from Apollo 11, the equipment in the foreground is covering the crosshair, not behind it. And in another from Apollo 12, the American flag is covering one crosshair, and the astronaut is covering the other. When presented with these questionable photos and videos,
It's absolutely unreal.
insist that Apollo was a hoax.
When I looked at all the pictures and all the footage, I'm absolutely convinced, I bet my life on it, that we didn't go to the moon. I know for a fact that we didn't.
Look what I have. I have the lunar lander, one of the lunar landers that landed on the moon. Now, let's have a closer look. Let's do this. And let's see, what material is this? What is this? With all this buckling. And let's look closer. Look, you see here at the top, they started with very good intentions. They said, we are going to make this look very neat and everything will be very great.
Also, the behavior of the astronauts upon their return to Earth is highly suspicious. Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin were made to sit and brief the press for nearly an hour and a half. At times, all 3 men exhibited a type of disinterest or absconding emotion, not to mention outright lying. The most obvious error was in an answer given by Collins. The astronauts were asked if they could see stars from the surface of the moon. Armstrong answered, "I don't recall." Then Collins, in an attempt to cover for Neil's mistake, and remembering his equal communal experience of sharing the capsule in Earth orbit for 8 days with his crewmates, blurted out, "I don't remember seeing any."
When you were carrying out that incredible moonwalk, did you find that the surface was equally firm anywhere, or were there harder and softer spots that you could detect? And secondly, when you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
The first part of your question, the surface did vary in its thickness of penetrate. One must be quite cautious in moving around in this rough terrain.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Transcripts published later attributed his remark to Aldrin, who was supposed to have been there on the surface. This was done, no doubt, to throw off most who had only had an altered transcript and not a film copy of the entire press conference.
Because you can see the stars.
Oh yeah.
You know, and pretty much all the time you can see the stars.
They are caught in a lie right there. What about the moon rocks, the laser reflector discs, and the photographs of the astronauts on the moon? The Apollo samples are not rocks gathered during moonwalks. They are, in fact, meteorites that were specifically gathered on Earth by von Braun himself before the moon landing ever took place. There are flags waving in the wind even though the moon exists in a vacuum, and astronauts that cannot jump more than 6 inches high on the first mission when the gravity is only 1/6 that of Earth's. But just the sheer perfection of the setups and appearances of the photos is enough to make you wonder whether they were shot in a studio. There is no fog on the film from immense temperature variation, no discoloration from radiation, no lightning streaks from micrometeoroids passing by. Other anomalies include photos that seem to be taken using artificial light. Apollo researcher David Percy traveled to Sweden to talk to Jan Lundberg, the man that managed the group in charge of supplying NASA with the advanced cameras used to take photographs on the moon.
Hasselblad in Sweden was the NASA-appointed manufacturer of a camera capable of functioning on the lunar surface, and Jan Lundberg was the project engineer responsible for building the camera.
Originally, NASA made all the alterations themselves. Then they presented what they had done to us and asked, can you do this? And we said, yes, we can. And we can do it better.
So what does Hasselblad have to say about this classic Aldrin picture? Does it look to Jan Lundberg as though the subject was lit?
Yes, it seems like he's standing in the spotlight. And I can't explain that. That escapes me. Why? So maybe you'll have to find Armstrong and ask him.
Mr. Armstrong, Bart Sibrel, ABC Digital. Wanted to give you the opportunity to swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon. Will you put your left hand on the Bible and swear to God that you walked on the moon?
Gentlemen. Mr. Sibrel.
Yes? If you really walked on the moon, why would you not do that? So why don't you just put the end to the record in the argument and put your hand on the Bible, swear to God you walked on the moon.
Mr. Sibrel, knowing you, that's probably a fake Bible.
Really? Well, no, it's a real Bible. You have the opportunity to have $5,000.
The meeting is not open.
Well, you have $5,000 cash. You can give it to charity if you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon.
Please
I have the
give it to
tape.
charity. It'd be fine.
Why don't you swear to? Why not? Why won't you do it? So why don't you put your hand on the Bible and swear to God that you walked on the moon?
So what purpose would it serve to contrive such an elaborate hoax? Let's take a brief look at the events leading up to the American space race. After the Russians thoroughly spooked America in 1957 with the launching of Sputnik, citizens were in fear that the USSR would soon be able to drop an atomic bomb on the United States from orbit. What could be done to avert such a disaster? And to what lengths would the United States government go to ensure national security?
The Soviet Union has launched a second Earth satellite.
Gets the American people alarmed that a foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this, and we fear this.
Man had his first great success in space when the Russians pushed a man across the threshold. He was Yuri Gagarin, the astronaut the Russians lionized as the first to orbit the Earth. It was the propaganda coup of the year. After the Russian flight, U.S. plans were accelerated. Commander Alan B. Shepard was sent into suborbital flight. Unlike the Russian venture, this took place in the white-hot glare of worldwide publicity. The Mercury capsule is right on course as the commander took over the controls to become the first man to guide a spacecraft.
As the tension increasingly rose between the world's two dominant post-war powers, the space race went into high gear, with Kennedy promising in 1961 to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
Well, I know for a fact you didn't walk on the moon.
That's fine. That's fine. It's okay if you know it. Do you understand that? You can have any opinion you want. That's what's wonderful about this country. You can believe anything you want. And it's okay with me, for sure.
Right.
Wilbur Wright once noted that the only bird that could talk was the parrot, and he didn't fly very well. So I'll be brief. This week, America has been recalling the Apollo program and reliving the memories of those times in which so many of us here, colleagues here in the first rows, were immersed. Today we have with us a group of students among America's best. To you, we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers. There are places to go beyond belief. Those challenges are yours. In many fields, not the least of which is space, because there lies human destiny.
Eager, idealistic faces, riveted on the first man on the moon, talking to them, and he looked at them and he said, "There are wonders beyond belief. There are truths to be revealed if one can remove truth's protective layers." Now, where in the world does one get the idea the truth has to have protection to be found out?
I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure that they too join with Americans in recognizing what an immense feat this is. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the sea of tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to earth.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great honor and privilege for us to be here.
The funny thing about the moon landing thing is, when I first started saying this stuff like 5 or 10 years ago, hardly anyone, almost everyone thought I was crazy. Like, they would get mad at me. They say, "That's not, it's too far this time, Jeff." It's like, I'm like, look at the information. Like, this is just factual evidence. It's just not possible they went to the moon. And it's funny now because a lot of people actually agree with me now. This is happening all over the place, sort of this lifting of the veil thing going on, this age of Aquarius, this conscious awakening, the internet, whatever it is. So a lot of people agree. So I get this a lot now. People go, yeah, okay, they obviously faked the moon landing videos, because, you can't have two shadows going different directions. You can't have the flag waving in the wind. There's just like so many things that you can just look up so easy. So a lot of people will say that to me now. They'll go, yeah, it's clear they obviously faked the videos, and then they'll go, but they went. It's like, why would they fake the videos but still go anyway? No, they just didn't go, man. They didn't go. Think about it. Just use your brain. I know it's hard. The fluoride, the chemtrails, the vaccinations with all the mercury, the government, your entire life in a government indoctrination camp. I know it's like hard to like think, but just try to think. Just try to use your head for a few seconds. Think about it. They didn't go, man. Not a fucking chance.